The Supreme Court opened its term today with a major action in support of gun control. The court refused to overturn a lower court ruling upholding a tough gun control law in a suburb of Chicago.
Gun groups quickly challenged the law, contending that the Bill of Rights guarantees the right to have a gun. The courts had never before ruled that the Second Amendment bestows such a right on individuals, and today the Supreme Court justices declined to intervene or to rule that the Constitution gives everyone the right to have a gun.
For the majority of American history, the Supreme Court upheld a very different interpretation of the Second Amendment. The court followed a theory that the amendment protected the right of states to maintain a militia, or an individual right to keep and bear arms within a militia, not an individual's right to own a firearm. Retired Chief Justice Warren Burger forcefully argued against that individual theory, pushed by groups like the National Rifle Association in a 1991 interview.
This has been the subject of one of the greatest pieces of fraud, I repeat the word fraud, on the American public by special interest groups that I have ever seen in my lifetime. Now just look at those words. There are only 3 lines to that amendment. A well-regulated militia. If the militia, which was going to be the state army, was going to be well-regulated, why shouldn't 16 and 17 and 18 or any other age persons be regulated in the use of arms?
But that precedent changed in 2008 when a 5-4 conservative majority opinion written by Justice Antonin Scalia overturned a 1975 Washington, D.C. handgun ban in District of Columbia versus Heller. The opinion was, the operative clause's text and history demonstrate that the Second Amendment connotes an individual right to keep and bear arms. That ruling forced handgun bans across the country to be repealed, including that ordinance outside of Chicago. It also broadened the scope of the Second Amendment, and there is a real likelihood that this 6-3 conservative court will expand that scope again. We are awaiting the court's ruling on a case involving a 108-year-old handgun licensing law in New York. If the court rules against the law, it could have huge implications for concealed carry laws and expand the access and prevalence of guns across the country. Joining me now to break it all down is Joyce Vance. She is an MSNBC legal analyst and a former United States attorney. Joyce, thanks for being here. Let's talk about the legal issues that are going on. In 2008, SCOTUS in the Heller case with a 5-4 decision with that opinion written by Justice Scalia basically said the Second Amendment protects individuals' rights to possess a firearm unconnected to service in a militia and to use that firearm for traditionally lawful purposes like self-defense. But there's that Supreme Court case that we're waiting to hear from, Bruen, that will be decided at the end of this current term. Can you share with us what your thoughts are about some of the implications that are going to come from the court's ruling in Bruen?
Sure. The way I look at it is that Bruen is the logical extension, if you're a Second Amendment supporter, of what happened in Heller. And Katie, it's worth pointing out that at the time the court handed down Heller, which, as you've said, was a 5-4 decision, it was startling. I don't think people seriously expected to see that result, which for the first time, contrary to decades of American history, said you had a right to possess a firearm in your home, that the District of Columbia could not tell you you could not have a gun in your home, couldn't put limits on guns inside of your home. What Bruen does is now it, in essence, says if the court decides in favor of the people who are supporting Second Amendment rights here, the court would say you have a right to possess a gun in public, because that's what the state of New York is trying to do. They're trying to require individuals to have a permit before they can engage in concealed carry. 2 of those individuals who were denied permits say, you know, the state of New York shouldn't really be in the business of telling us whether we can carry guns in public. So it would be a dramatic step forward in Second Amendment rights when, if you go back to the basics in Heller, Justice Scalia had to really torture the grammar of the Second Amendment to reach the conclusion he reached. He said, well, this language about right to bear arms is separate from the language about a well-regulated militia, but a plain common sense reading by everyday Americans tells you that that reading that enabled the Supreme Court to reach that result was very, very gymnastically done in order to change the plain meaning of the Second Amendment.
And, you know, Joyce, the irony doesn't escape me that there's often criticism about the idea of a, quote, activist judge basically trying to interpret the law to be able to achieve a result, which sounds like is exactly what happened with Justice Scalia. But after the shooting that just happened a few days ago in Uvalde, there have been renewed calls to repeal the Second Amendment. And we heard the actual text of the Second Amendment, and it says a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Joyce, it's not a complicated amendment. It's not complicated language at all. I mean, why is it that we are getting this very tortured interpretation of the Second Amendment? And frankly, do you think there's any credence or idea that the Second Amendment could be repealed at this point?
That tortured amendment, or rather interpretation of the amendment, is likely fueled in large part by money that the NRA put into the issue. There was strong lobbying to politicize this issue. You know, decades ago, it was police chiefs and sheriffs who didn't want to see an end to the ban on assault weapons. They understood that would make our communities more vulnerable. Somehow the NRA managed to change that national conversation, and that leads us to where we are today. So you ask about repealing the Second Amendment, which I know is being suggested in some quarters. That's been part of the conversation ever since the Heller decision was handed down. Let's set aside for the moment the fact that it's highly unlikely that that would ever actually happen. It's in many ways not desirable because of that pre-Heller interpretation of the Second Amendment, which does guarantee that states can have well-regulated militias and that firearms can be stored at these buildings that we see in states that are labeled armories, places where we store guns for our militias that are there to protect us. That's very different from saying that you have a right to carry a gun wherever you want to out in public. That's the path that Heller set us on, the path that many of us fear Bruen will continue to walk down.
But the founders, right, Joyce, they never anticipated this idea of 18-year-olds going and obtaining AR-15s to execute 21 innocent lives in the span of minutes. There's a very kind of difficult conversation to be had about the idea, about the evolution of this living, breathing document, which is supposed to be the United States Constitution. We have a conservative SCOTUS majority right now. Do you believe that any efforts that are made to be able to advance significant gun reform legislation on a federal level is going to survive if it's challenged and it's before this current makeup of the Supreme Court?
That's really up to the voters in large part. Yes, the Supreme Court will play a role in reviewing whatever laws are put forward. But if you take Heller as the state of the law, Heller still allows states to do a lot. There's no conflict with Heller in permitting, for instance, universal background checks. Heller explicitly carves out the ability for states and for the federal government, which does this extensively, to regulate the types of guns you can own. For instance, it's illegal to have a fully automatic weapon. It's illegal to have a sawed-off shotgun. So those sorts of restrictions could remain in place. There's no reason to believe the court wouldn't permit states to regulate ownership so that people under 21 would be unable to purchase a firearm. And of course, there was, at this point prior to the Bush administration letting it elapse, there was a ban on high-capacity magazines, these magazines that let, for instance, the shooter in Las Vegas continue to shoot, I think, 100 rounds at a time without having to stop to reload. And prior to the end of the ban during the Bush administration, people understood how critical it was that those moments that would force a shooter to take time to reload gave law enforcement the opportunity to intervene. So without really doing anything that should convince this Supreme Court that it's out of balance, it would be possible to enact those sorts of restrictions. That's, of course, why this issue needs to remain on the front burner for voters when they go to the polls in November.
Well, Joyce Vance, I know that you and I are watching very carefully to see what the Supreme Court does, not only in Dobbs, but also in Bruen at the end of the session, which is coming up, frankly, in just a few weeks. But I thank you for being here today and for your wisdom. Thank you so much.